Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for April 28th, 2014. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today I'm joined by John Hogoboom. And John, you've been kind of cleaning up with the Heartbleed. How's it going?
Yeah, I think we've got everything under control for the most part, so it's pretty much quieted down. But that was a big item over the past few weeks or so, but now Absolutely. It's pretty good.
All right, good deal. Joined by Matt Kaiser here in the studio. And Matt, what's been up?
Oh, a whole bunch of stuff. Most interesting is working on algorithms to identify websites that look like they are particular brands, but they actually aren't.
All right, so that absolutely would be a concern for any organization, that is to try to make sure that domains aren't posing as you, phishing sites, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. So be looking forward to seeing how that progresses going forward. And joined online with Jim Clausing. And Jim, I think you have the prime story for the day here.
Yeah, it's gotten a lot of attention over the weekend.
So why don't we go ahead and jump right into it. You know, we are always a little apprehensive about these 0 days. Tell us what's going on.
Yeah, Saturday, FireEye posted a blog article. They've detected a new 0-day exploit in Internet Explorer. And then Microsoft promptly followed it up with a security bulletin of their own. The exploit that they've seen in the wild is currently targeted at IE 9 through 11. Mm-hmm. The exploit bypasses both ASLR, that's address space layout randomization, and DEP. It is being used so far in targeted attacks. They sound kind of APT-ish, but we don't have a whole lot of detail on the attacks. Mm-hmm. But the vulnerability itself exists in all versions of Internet Explorer from 6 through 11. So this makes it the first significant vulnerability that we're aware of that is not going to be patched for IE general users who haven't upgraded from XP yet.
We could probably flash back to a previous episode where I said we probably have found most of the vulnerabilities that we're going to find with XP, but then we also talked about the Internet Explorer as being possibly, if you're still using XP, perhaps should consider using a different browser. It seems like most of the issues that are discovered recently are associated with browsers.
So the current exploit that has been seen in the wild is also leveraging Flash to actually exploit the vulnerability within IE. So one of the workarounds for the particular exploit that has been seen in the wild is to disable Flash. Also, you can use Microsoft's EMET, the Enhanced Mitigation Experience Toolkit. The latest versions, 4.1 and 5, are both able to block this particular vulnerability from being able to be exploited. Now, earlier versions of EMET do not offer this protection, so you need to be up to the current versions, 4.1 or 5. It's gotten a lot of attention. The fact that Microsoft released their bulletin on a Saturday means they're taking it very seriously. Not sure if they're going to get an out-of-cycle patch for this one or whether it'll be in the regular Tuesday patches in May. It is one that is getting a lot of attention right now. So the other workarounds are obviously use a different browser other than Internet Explorer. But as FireEye pointed out, the versions that are being targeted in the wild right now constitute, in 2013, constituted 26% of the browsers being used out there. So it is something to be worried about. I expect we'll see, now that it's hit the press, we'll see more exploits targeting this vulnerability in the days to come.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I tend to get confused from time to time, Jim. I think you just sort of pointed out there is that there is a fundamental distinction between the vulnerability and the exploit itself, and that you can have multiple exploits that are targeting that vulnerability. You really have to capture the vulnerability or correct the vulnerability. And we're seeing one exploit that could certainly expand in terms of scope and could sort of hide under the covers if we're not careful about it.
Yeah, with the attention that it's got, I expect to see a lot more folks publishing exploit code here in the days to come.
All right. So, I guess in the viewer mailbag here, perhaps you kind of touched on this really. Our concern was that XP is not being supported anymore. What can we do to deal with the XP side?
As I said, this appears to be the first significant vulnerability since XP went out of receiving patches anymore, went out of support, that where XP is conceivably vulnerable. In this particular case, your choices are really limited to probably using a different browser if you're not willing to upgrade to a newer version of Windows. That said, the folks that did pay for extended support, and there have been in the news a couple of significant large agencies that have done that, they will actually get a patch for this most likely.
Right.
But the majority of users out there that are still running XP, to avoid this one, you're going to have to probably avoid IE.
Right. And so, I guess the thing that comes to mind is, we've talked about ATMs that still have XP in them and things. My guess, and this is a guess, but my guess is they're not really using a browser at all. But you think that's a reasonable assumption?
The issue is the way that Internet Explorer is tied in so deeply to the bowels of the Windows operating system. It's almost impossible to run a Windows OS and rip IE out entirely. So even though ideally you shouldn't ever be using a browser on those embedded type systems for much of anything, IE is probably still installed there, and it's probably an older version, a vulnerable version. So but that's conjecture on my part. I don't know for sure. I have a friend who works in that industry, and maybe I ought to hit him up and ask him some questions on that.
All right. Well, perhaps there'll be some additional commentary for next week on this topic. All right. Well, thanks for that, Jim. And next item here, I guess there's never any shortage of fraud going on, but I guess there's kind of a new little twist that, at least it's relatively new to me, John. What can you tell us?
Well, right. So the guys over at TrustedSec have put out a blog posting here about a large-scale cyber wire fraud scam that's been going on. So this is kind of us letting other people know, hey, look out for this, especially affecting lots of large companies in the United States. And what they're doing is they will do a little research to figure out what third-party vendors or partners that company that they're targeting might have, maybe contractors or whatnot, or other types of vendors that they might deal with. And they'll try to compromise that company to get an email account over at the accounts payable department over at that third-party vendor. And then they'll start spoofing an email to that victim saying, hey, we need a credit for this particular invoice, or you misbilled, we need a chargeback, et cetera, kind of thing here. So if they can trick the users into doing that, they can get the wire fraud, get them to wire the money to a bank account of theirs. Now, they're really aggressive in this. They will, they're very convincing. They'll spoof an email from that third-party vendor, but then if it even looks questionable, they're getting, not the right response, they'll spoof emails from inside the company saying to the accounts payable department inside that company saying, hey, you guys really need to take action on this credit, to try to coerce them. They'll also use the phone to cold call the people at the accounts payable department and say, hey, and they're also no accent. They don't sound like they, your typical social engineering. So they're pretty articulate. In any event, so that's kind of the crux of the wire fraud scam. and they've seen anywhere from $50,000 to $1 million going out of certain companies, not necessarily in one transaction, but over the time that this has been going on. I'm not quite sure if they say how long it's been going on, but something that you want to be aware of from what they've looked at. And I'm sure law enforcement's been involved in this activity. Most of the money is being wired to banks over in China, but not exclusively. And I don't know if there's any connection there or not. So the long and the short, I would say companies should be aware of this. They should notify, do some awareness and education around this possible scam with their accounts payable teams and other financial departments. You also want to make sure if you do become a victim, get in touch with law enforcement to let them know that this has happened. And in terms of just transactions in general that you're having from this point forward, or maybe even a little retrospectively, look and verify all of your transactions that you had with your vendors to make sure that this isn't happening or that it has happened in the past.
Right. So this sounds like really an authorization type thing. That correct me if I'm wrong. It sounds like they're using email that's actually from within the companies that of the vendors in this case, or even perhaps even the victim company. Is that right?
So they do, but if they can't, there are cases where they will try to compromise a third-party partner that you have. If they can't do that, they'll actually register a domain that looks very similar to that company, and then they'll start spoofing email or sending email from that fake domain, trying to purport that they are in fact from that vendor. Yeah.
So it kind of leads toward, in the past, I think we've taken email as kind of as a fairly authentic form of communications. It's kind of ridiculous to even think that, considering all the spamming and spoofing that's going on. But in the context of doing payment authorizations, that sort of thing, we really should be thinking about a stronger form of security around it. I know a lot of organizations, we've kind of struggled with using S-MIME, partly because it's been kind of clunky and you run into a lot of troubles with certificates and managing books and things like that. There are some web-based services. I know that we use Voltage, for example, that are helpful. But looking for things to help make sure you know who you're talking with, have some better controls around that. It sounds like if they've compromised internal machines, you could potentially subvert some of the mechanisms around that, but at least it's going to give you an extra level of measure of protection against this type of thing, right?
Sometimes the best thing is just to have a phone number on record with that vendor that you always communicate with their accounts payable. You get any kind of transactions, just give them a call. Write to a number that you already know, not one that you received in an email from the fraudster, but something that you've already pre-established, and give them a call to verify. It's much more difficult
to spoof a personal relationship.
Right.
So, good point. All right, so thank you, John, for that. And let's go to Matt here. And Matt, it's a little past St. Patrick's Day, but I guess there's still the BadLepricon around. What can you tell us?
So Lookout posted a blog entry about this malware they found in the Google Play Store called BadLepricon. And it was packaged in as a part of a bunch of what's called live wallpapers for Android. So basically you have your phone open and it's doing something in the background, almost like a desktop with an animation. And these things run all the time. And this was doing Bitcoin mining, completely not in the EULA for the software. They just start using your phone to mine cryptocurrency, which it takes a significant amount of battery and heats up the phone. These things, but I find this one a little bit more interesting. We've seen ones before where it'll actually burn out components of the phone because the phone is not meant to sit there and churn all day. And actually, a previous one called CoinCrypt, I think it was called, or CryptCoin. Forgive me on that one, but this one, BadLepricon, actually puts in some checks to say, is the screen off, and is the battery above 50, and there's one more in there. And it's not so much being nice as it is preserving its own platform without destroying the phone.
Self-preservation.
Yep, so it's kind of interesting that they're still mining Bitcoin on a relatively low-powered platform. I mean, this is not the lowest powered platform we've seen Bitcoin mining on. We've seen it on DVRs and all sorts of other embedded stuff that take forever if we even mine a single Bitcoin. Other ones will mine, Dogecoin, Litecoin, other low-hanging fruit style cryptocurrencies because it's much easier to make advances in that. But whereas in Bitcoin, it's all sort of like tapped out at this point. You really have to work at it. You have to have a whole farm to make any money.
Right.
But it's interesting that we see this in the Google Play Store again. Google's supposed to have the bouncer platform to protect against this sort of malware. But, as we all know, AV it does its best, can't always catch things.
Well, and this isn't exactly a propagating virus or something. I could see where it could slip in, and eventually it's going to get flagged and then and get pulled out. So I'm still a big advocate of using the mainstream markets because they do have the protections around this, and enough people that are using those markets that they're going to report problems and ultimately get those bad applications pulled off. And I don't know, Jim, do you have any thoughts on this particular topic?
You want to stick with the major markets, and Lookout told Google about this, and they've pulled the ones that they're aware of. So again, the first time that we heard about Bitcoin mining on an Android, I was wondering why they'd want to do it on such a low-powered device for just the reasons that Matt talked about. But well.
Well, theoretictically, if you have enough of them, you're going to actually make a little bit of progress, and perhaps an experiment. How much to see how much you can really capture and whether you can do something effective. The Bitcoin mining thing really is going to be somewhat dependent on having sort of a long-term capture. That is, can you sustain that device and use it for a long period of time? That's where you're going to kind of get some of the payoff, and then obviously you want to be able to scale horizontally as well.
So another interesting thing is that they're using a stratum proxy, which is sort of a way of collecting the efforts of many Bitcoin mining individuals into a single one. So that's some sort of coordination. That's interesting.
It also affords some anonymity into the wallet, that's behind that stratum proxy. So
right. And you were saying that it's interesting that the Bitcoin mining thing is going on here on the mobile platform. The author of the blog actually made a good point that it may make sense in the long run to see Bitcoin mining done on these small devices as an alternative to advertising within the apps.
Oh,
so if you can monetize an Android application without having to shove ads in someone's face, I'm for that.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Can you actually get the turnaround? Can you get a Bitcoin, which is what they're around $700, $800 or something like that, probably about now. And so, that's a decent return for somebody doing that if you can get folks that are going to agree to it. But you can't hide it. Exactly. I think that's the significance. You can't hide it. All right, very good. So let's go ahead and take a look at the internet weather for this last week or so here. And first thing I wanted to share with you was actually a sort of an interesting observation. This, we've been talking a lot about reflection attack activity, and this is one where we haven't seen too much reflection attack activity using SNMP as the reflection vector. I've certainly read about some significant cases in the past, and there have been some correction measures put in place in a lot of networks to help prevent this sort of thing. But this is a case where at least there was a sustained attack activity. Started around, I guess this was on April 23rd, about midday, and has continued through, and it looks like it's may continue to be taking place as we speak here at a lesser extent. This is still not significant. It's not a huge attack, but certainly one that we want to be watching for. That is, if you see a lot of source traffic, or if you have, perhaps more pertinent, if you have devices that are exposed to the internet that have SNMP capability, you want to make sure that that's turned off or block it in some manner. Next item here is sources probing on port 443 TCP. We talked a little bit about Heartbleed early in the program here. It's kind of winding down, but there certainly are organizations that are running around still looking to see what devices might be susceptible to Heartbleed. This is more of a low and slow kind of activity. Generally, to me, that kind of equates to perhaps some malicious intent behind it. There certainly has been a lot of probing activity looking for devices just to scan the internet and see what the landscape is. But this is more persistent. It's low, slow, using a lot of different IP addresses to kind of hide the sources. Most of these sources are in Argentina, or coming from Argentina, I should say. There's also a U.S. university that we think actually has legitimate intent behind it. It's a lesser extent in terms of the number of addresses doing the probing. Most of the probes actually, despite the fact that we're really showing the number of sources doing the probing, most of the probes are still from a small number of sources in China. Next item here is scan probes on port 8009 TCP. This is actually the Apache JServe protocol. John's nodding his head here. You've seen this before. This is probing activity, most likely looking for Tomcat servers, which we've seen a lot, and uses drop servers, for example.
Right. APT actors have been using Tomcat a lot, or exploiting vulnerable Tomcat servers. I don't know that that's what this is. I'm just saying that Tomcat has been targeted before, so not a big surprise here.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this from a few different source addresses in China. It's kind of moved around a little bit. It's not as if it's very pervasive. And I'm also including here on this slide a link to a blog that talks a little bit about, this is sort of the unknown port associated with Tomcat, and one that is shows up as maybe accessible from a server if you haven't deliberately done something to control it. Next item here is scan probes on port 1900 UDP. This is Simple Service Delivery Protocol, which is actually a sort of an underlying or supporting protocol associated with universal plug and play. And there are actually kind of two possibilities here. I think we've speculated in the past that the actors might be looking for vulnerable universal plug and play servers, but this is also potentially a vector, being a UDP protocol, that could be used for reflection attacks. We haven't seen a lot of significant activity around this particular port in reflection attacks, but that is certainly a possibility. Now, John, maybe there's an organization apparently that's doing some probing deliberately, not for malicious purposes.
Right, trying to enumerate how many devices are out there that are exposing the SSDP as a vector for reflection. So, they're trying to get a handle on it so that maybe we could, if there are large pockets of these in particular organizations or companies, et cetera, they can do some notification to say, you might want to clean these up, or at least verify whether they should be open to the internet in general. Like we said, DNS has always been traditionally the reflection vector protocol, but lately we've seen NTP, we've seen CareGen, we saw SNMP, now SSDP. So there's, they're investigating all sorts of these UDP protocols to see what they could leverage, the bad guys can leverage as a reflection vector for attack.
Right. So some of this activity seems to fit the profile of what we thought might be associated with these, these good actors that trying to inform folks. But some of these bigger spikes that we've seen recently don't seem to fit that profile. So it seems to be perhaps another organization. They may be perfectly legitimate, but I'm not sure why an organization from China, for example, would be probing the United States for informational purposes or to notify organizations. So, and that is the case that some of these bigger spikes are coming from a source in China. That's the case with this particular port. I didn't go and take a look specifically at others, that is other ports that are associated with reflection attacks to see if there was an association or relationship between those, but perhaps we can take a look at that for next week. Next item here is basically looking at our standard pie chart, the most probed ports. No particular surprises here considering the things we've been reporting lately. This is at the top of the list here, port 22, next in line port 23, and then next in line the port 5000 TCP. These are all associated with these this internet of insecure things that are being compromised and used for bots, and subsequently used to find others that can be compromised and using them for other activities too. We still have port 445 here, surprisingly diminished compared to what we typically see. Next is port 443, a lot of this probing activity for what we had referred to earlier, probing looking for Heartbleed vulnerable servers. 1433, that's a Microsoft SQL database, usually password guessing, as is 3389, which is remote desktop protocol, same sort of thing. And then follow that by what I'll describe as generic probing, that's 8 ICMP, which is basically a ping request. And then we have port 80 and port 8080 looking for perhaps vulnerable web servers. Next is the most sources doing the probing. High on the list here, port 443 TCP. That's we already looked at the graph associated with that. We see a significant growth in the number of sources that are doing that probing. Next in line, port 445. I was in the process of actually assembling a sort of a long-term trend view of port 445 and found that it doesn't look like there's a lot of activity to diminish. That is, it's not diminishing significantly. I was actually, so perhaps we'll be able to take a look at a graph of that next time. And then next followed by port 23, port 80, port 8080, a couple of ICMP ports here, and then port 5000 TCP showed up here. Now we know what the port 5000 activity is, but this is the first I recall it's showing up in terms of the on the most sources doing the probing. And we have reported on this a number of other times. So I'm showing on this graph the last 90 days of activity in terms of sources that are probing, that is number of sources probing on port 5000 TCP. And again, this is a Synology Disk Station Manager. And we continue to see sort of this sawtooth pattern. The first tooth in the saw here was the initial scanning activity. Apparently they were getting something they wanted, got pretty aggressive, renewed that scanning activity a number of times. And it looks like it's more into maintenance mode at this point. That is to perhaps regain devices that have been rebooted or something, and they're trying to get those back online, which incidentally, I'm not sure we've mentioned this before, but most of these exploits that we've seen in the past where the devices are compromised, you can reset the device, power down or do a power reset, and that will generally clear the malware out. It's not a persistent storage of the malware, but it also opens it up for the vulnerability again, so it could potentially be exploited again unless you do something to change passwords, that sort of thing.
Yeah, particularly with those DVRs, it seems like a lot of those only allow you to write files into the temp space, which will get flushed when you reboot the thing.
You'd have to do a firmware write to somewhere on the board itself to change that.
Right.
That's why you have to. If you have your own home routers, you got to go in there, reboot the whole thing, install the firmware. It's not like you can just make a change.
Right. And last but not least item here, just thought I'd share with you the Daily Reconnaissance Index and how that's progressing along. We had some significant spikes occur in the last few months, but it seems like it's stabilized a little bit, where we're still well above what we'd hoped to see, down in the 30s last year, and we're still way up into the into the 40s and almost into the 50s at this point. Most of this is in terms of the number of probes, as opposed to, you see in the blue down here, there hasn't been a real significant change in terms of the number of sources. That's significant because what tends to change when you have a significant worm that's propagating is a lot of sources that are showing up. We haven't seen real significant changes in the sources, so we don't have what I would describe as a mass infection, but we certainly have what I would describe as pretty aggressive probing activity that's taking place. All right, so that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can contact us through email at threattrak@list.att.com, and follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. The ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel, also available on YouTube, and there's an audio-only version on iTunes. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, John Hogoboom. Online, we have Jim Clausing and Matt Kaiser here in the studio as well, if you want to call it a studio or lounge area. This is where we actually work on a day-to-day basis. I'm not sitting on the couch necessarily. And of course, we'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.